A 15-year-old girl is crying through her own wedding, and nobody in the room intends to stop the ceremony. It is the 4th of November, 1677, at St. James's Palace. The bride is Mary Stuart. She has been weeping all afternoon. The groom beside her in the candlelight is William of Orange, a foreign prince from across the narrow sea. He turns 27 years old today. For a quarter of a century, England and his homeland have fought 3 bitter wars. This young girl is simply the living condition of a peace treaty. He is severe, disciplined and frail in health. He is not here for romance. He is here to secure an alliance. Looking at them now, you see a transaction between 2 royal houses. 11 years from tonight, these 2 will return to this city to take the throne. Her uncle the king arranged this marriage and will oversee their bedding tonight. But the crown they take will belong to her own father. They will be crowned together. 1 king and 1 queen, both fully ruling, neither one a consort. It is the only joint coronation in English history. It has never happened before, and it never happens again. Tonight, we will trace both of these lives, one after the other, in their entirety. One is a soldier who spent his life chasing a single goal. The other is a woman who held the only legal right of succession in the entire revolution. We begin with a man who never wanted an English crown at all. In the 3rd week of May, 1672, Dutch farmers are walking out to their own fields and opening the gates to let the sea in. They are drowning their own land. The cold saltwater rushes over the dark soil, swallowing the spring crops and turning the province of Holland into a vast artificial island. They are doing this because the French army is only 3 weeks away from the gates of Amsterdam, and this rising water is the only wall they have left. The order to destroy the harvest comes from a 21-year-old man. For his entire life, the laws of the Dutch Republic have been meticulously written to keep him out of power. The men who run the government have spent 2 decades trying to suppress him. Yet now, with their survival hanging in the balance, the nation has turned to the very youth they once feared. He watches the dark water rise, knowing that he is buying his country just a few more days to live. It is a choice that will define how he sees the world for the rest of his life. Welcome to yesterday's voices, where history is spoken. Today, we trace the quiet intertwined paths of 2 monarchs who reshaped the balance of Europe. This first story belongs to a man often remembered for seizing the English throne. Yet he viewed that throne as little more than a weapon. William III did not cross the sea and conquer England because he hungered for it. He requisitioned it. He took the crown in the exact same way a desperate general takes a fortress, simply to drain its resources for a larger war. To him, the Glorious Revolution was not a grand domestic triumph. It was merely a second front in the single, consuming obsession of his existence, his lifelong fight against King Louis XIV of France. This is why he would wear the English crown for 13 years without ever truly becoming an Englishman. He would avoid the heavy air of London. He would leave the kingdom to fight endless, muddy campaigns across the continent. And when he finally forced a peace, the only prize he truly demanded was not gold or territory, but a simple signature acknowledging his right to rule. He gave everything to halt a rising empire, sacrificing his physical health, his peace of mind, and the affection of the very people he governed. But what kind of man looks at a golden throne and sees only a sword? The child nobody could own. In the freezing winter of 1650, the most powerful political position in the Dutch Republic suddenly fell empty. William II, the Prince of Orange and the stadholder of the nation's most influential provinces, died of smallpox. He was only 24 years old. He left behind a fractured government, a grieving court, and a wife who was heavily pregnant. Exactly 8 days after his final breath, his young widow gave birth to a son. From the very moment he opened his eyes, this infant was the head of the House of Orange. But a newborn cannot command armies. An infant cannot negotiate international treaties, and he certainly cannot hold the demanding office of stadholder. For the first time in generations, the Dutch Republic was left without a leader from its paramount family. The men who ran the state saw an unprecedented opportunity. They quietly ushered in a new era, leaving the office of stadholder entirely vacant. It was a calculated vacuum of power that would last for 22 long years, and at the absolute centre of it was a fatherless child, entirely unaware of the political storm raging over his cradle. Because he was the Prince of Orange, this newborn was not viewed simply as a boy. He was viewed as a vital political asset. Whoever controlled him controlled the vast loyalties of the military and the common people. Whoever raised him would have the power to shape the future of the Republic itself. The battle for his custody began before he was even baptized. It began with his name. His mother, Mary Stuart, was an English princess. She was the daughter of King Charles I, tried and executed by his own parliament the year before, and she wanted to name her newborn son Charles to honour her grieving, exiled family. But his grandmother, the formidable Amalia of Solms-Braunfels, had a very different plan. She insisted that the boy must be named William, to honour the father who had just died, and to cement his rightful place in the Dutch political dynasty. The two women fought bitterly over the cradle. The grandmother won. The boy was christened William. But a name was only the beginning. The struggle over who would physically raise him escalated until it reached the Supreme Court of the provinces of Holland and Zeeland. The judges handed down a fractured, pragmatic verdict. They divided the guardianship of the child into 3. He would be managed by his mother, his grandmother, and a powerful German uncle, Frederick William, the Elector of Brandenburg. He was a boy carved into pieces, a living bargaining chip, shared among 3 competing courts with no single place to call his own. How do you protect a child when he is treated not as a son, but as a political weapon? Perhaps because she had lost the bitter battle for control, or perhaps because the heavy atmosphere of the Dutch court was suffocating, his mother did not stay. Mary Stuart had spent much of William's early childhood living abroad. She travelled to Paris. She stayed in Bruges. She kept her distance from the Republic that had stripped her of the sole authority over her own son. And then on Christmas Eve in 1660, when William was only 10 years old, she died. The cause was smallpox, the exact same disease that had killed his father a decade earlier. With his mother gone, the boy's upbringing was left entirely to the governors appointed by his grandmother. Yet, history is full of quiet accidents that slowly shape the world. Because of his mother's English roots, the household chosen to raise him was heavily British. He was placed in the care of Walburg Howard, an English gentlewoman, and Lady Anna Mackenzie, a Scottish noblewoman. Day after day, year after year, this Dutch prince grew up listening to the cadence of the English language. He learned its rhythms. He understood the subtle nuances of the men and women who spoke it. Nobody planned it this way, but this isolated child in The Hague was being meticulously prepared to rule a kingdom across the sea. But if his voice was shaped by the British, his soul was shaped by the Dutch. William was raised in the Reformed faith. He grew into a deeply committed, almost puritanical Calvinist. His mind was sharpened by serious, heavy men. He was tutored by religious scholars like Cornelis Trigland, who taught him to view the world through the strict, unforgiving lens of divine providence. He was mentored by Constantine Huygens, one of the greatest scholars of the Dutch Golden Age, a man who had faithfully served both his father and his grandfather. Under their watchful eyes, William became a boy devoid of childhood. He was serious, reserved and old far beyond his years. He was taught that his family had a divine mandate to lead, and that his current exile from power was merely a test of his endurance. At the age of 9, an age when most children are still playing in the gardens, William was sent to the University of Leiden. It was the most prestigious institution in the Republic. He would remain there for 7 years, quietly studying, quietly watching, and quietly waiting. He was growing into a capable, highly disciplined young man. But no matter how much he studied, and no matter how pure his bloodline was, the doors of power remained firmly locked against him. While William was reading theology in Leiden, the government of the Republic was being run by men who despised everything the House of Orange stood for. And at the absolute head of that government was a brilliant, unyielding statesman. This man looked at the young prince and saw only a fatal threat to the Republic. He had spent his entire career writing laws, passing edicts, and manoeuvring alliances for one single purpose. He was going to make absolutely certain that the boy named William would never, ever rule. The law written to keep him out. The man who stood between William and the power of his ancestors was Johan de Witt. He had served as the Grand Pensionary of the Dutch Republic since 1653, and he was the architect of a republican era that had no room for princes. To de Witt, the House of Orange was a dangerous relic, but he did not have to fight the boy alone. He had powerful allies abroad. In 1654, the Dutch signed the Treaty of Westminster, ending a bruising naval war with England. The English leader, Oliver Cromwell, insisted on a secret clause. He demanded that the young Prince of Orange be permanently barred from becoming stadholder of the province of Holland. Cromwell had put his name to the death warrant of Charles I and had no desire to see the dead king's grandson rise to power across the sea. It is a strange historical paradox. The very first nation to write a law explicitly designed to keep William out of power was England. The kingdom he would one day conquer. For a brief moment, the walls around William seemed to soften. In 1660, the boy's uncle, Charles II, was restored to the English throne. The protection of a sitting English king forced the Dutch government to treat the young prince with caution. But the political weather in 17th century Europe was notoriously fragile. A new Anglo-Dutch war erupted in 1665. With English warships firing on Dutch fleets, William's royal protection evaporated. For how could the Republic entrust its armies to the nephew of the enemy king? Johan de Witt moved quickly to close the net. In 1667, he pushed through a piece of legislation known as the Perpetual Edict. On paper, it looked like a compromise. The edict promised that William would be appointed Captain General of the Republic's armies, but only when he turned 23 in 1673, bypassing his 18th birthday when his supporters expected him to come of age. The true lethality of the edict lay in a single quiet clause. It stated that whoever held the military office of Captain General could never hold the political office of stadholder. It was a trap forged in ink. William was being offered the army, but only if he permanently surrendered his birthright. What followed was a slow, grinding legal war. In September 1668, as William neared his 18th birthday, his supporters outmanoeuvred de Witt by securing him the title of First Noble of the province of Zeeland. His grandmother immediately declared that he had attained his legal majority. De Witt's counterattack was swift and absolute. In 1670, he convinced the province of Holland, the richest and most powerful territory in the Republic, to abolish the office of stadholder entirely. If the boy wanted the office, de Witt would simply erase the office from existence. Yet William kept moving forward. That same year, he managed to secure a seat on the Council of State with full voting rights. He was slowly clawing his way into the rooms where the decisions were made. And the men sitting across from him were beginning to realize exactly who they were dealing with. He was not a typical youth. William was severe, quiet, and strikingly mature. He did not possess the easy charm of his Stuart relatives across the Channel. He was dry and withdrawn, a young man who had spent his entire life under hostile surveillance. He was also physically fragile. From childhood, he suffered from severe asthma and a chronic respiratory illness. It was a weakness that would follow him all his life, leaving him gasping for air in the damp winters of the Low Countries, and teaching him to ignore the limitations of his own body. He kept his circle extremely small, reserving his trust for a few loyal companions. The closest among them was a young man named Hans Willem Bentinck. In the mid-1670s, William contracted smallpox, the exact disease that had killed both his mother and his father. Bentinck stayed by his bedside day and night, nursing the prince through the fever. He did this knowing that smallpox killed roughly 15% of those who caught it and left the survivors heavily scarred. Bentinck risked his own life, and in doing so, won William's absolute, lifelong devotion. Such intense devotion to his male companions did not go unnoticed. There were whispers in the courts of Europe that the prince's affections were directed entirely toward men. The evidence from the time is thin, surviving mostly as court gossip and the speculative letters of his enemies. If the rumours were true, William was far too disciplined to ever act on them openly. He was a man who yielded nothing to his opponents, keeping his private heart as heavily guarded as his political ambitions. He was a prince without an office, waiting in the shadows of a republic that did not want him. In May of 1672, the French army would cross the border, and the farmers would open the sea gates to drown the land. You already know how that crisis began, but what you do not yet know is that the labyrinth of laws Johan de Witt had spent 20 years building to contain this young man was about to collapse in just 6 weeks. And the price of that collapse would be paid in blood. The year they called the disaster. 1672 is remembered in Dutch history simply as the Rampjaar, the disaster year. In the span of just 3 weeks in May and June, tens of thousands of French soldiers poured across the borders, sweeping aside fortresses and overrunning a vast portion of the Republic. By the time the sea gates were finally opened and the land was swallowed by the dark water, the military defence had essentially collapsed. The artificial sea held the French back from the gates of Amsterdam, but it left the country paralysed, trapped behind its own flooded fields. Yet, the French king, Louis XIV, made a fatal miscalculation. He had secured a crushing military victory, but he failed to exploit it politically. He paused. He waited for a formal surrender that never came. And in that quiet, devastating vacuum, the 21-year-old Prince of Orange finally made his move. William understood that a terrified nation requires a scapegoat. He publicly declared that his uncle, the English King Charles II, had only allied with the French because of the deep insults inflicted on the House of Orange by Johan de Witt. It was a masterful piece of political leverage. He then withdrew his remaining forces directly into the province of Holland, the very heartland of the Republican faction that had spent 2 decades trying to destroy him. From there, secure behind the wall of seawater, he waited for the political tide to turn. He did not have to wait long. The sheer terror of the French invasion broke the resolve of the Republican government. The Grand Pensionary and his allies had led the nation into an unprecedented catastrophe, and the panicked people now demanded a saviour. On the 4th of July, 1672, the government of Holland completely abandoned the Perpetual Edict. They formally appointed William as stadholder. The provinces of Zeeland, Utrecht, Gelderland and Overijssel swiftly followed suit. It had been exactly 22 years since the young prince's father had died of smallpox. For 22 years, the office had sat empty, wrapped in careful legislation designed to keep it out of his hands forever. Now, in the span of a few chaotic weeks, it all belonged to him again. The first stadholderless period was officially over. But the transition of power was not finished, for a change of regime in a time of war is rarely a bloodless affair. The profound anger of the Dutch people needed a target. For months, a highly organised campaign of smear pamphlets and forged documents had been circulating through the streets. They depicted Johan de Witt and his brother Cornelis as corrupt, treacherous men who had secretly conspired with the French to sell out the Republic. It was entirely false, but truth has very little currency in a starving, terrified nation. The mob was systematically fed on this hysteria, and the hysteria demanded an execution. In early August, Cornelis de Witt was arrested on fabricated charges of treason. He was taken to the prison in The Hague and brutally tortured. Yet, despite the unimaginable agony, the aging statesman refused to confess to a crime he did not commit. Without a signed confession, the judges could not legally sentence him to death. Instead, they stripped him of his offices and sentenced him to permanent exile. But exile was not enough for the crowds gathering outside the prison walls. On the 20th of August, Johan de Witt arrived at the prison to help his brother prepare for his departure. Before they could safely leave, a heavily armed mob breached the iron gates. They dragged the two brothers out into the street, and there, the two architects of the Republican era were killed. What the crowd did next has troubled Dutch historians ever since. The bodies were mutilated, parts of them were eaten, fingers and tongues were sold in the streets as souvenirs of the disaster year. It is an event that still stains the Dutch historical memory, and it is here that we must pause to untangle the myth from the man. Historians still argue about William's exact role in this atrocity. Some believe he orchestrated the assassination from the shadows to permanently eliminate his rivals. Others insist he was miles away, completely unaware that the political anger he stoked would devolve into such barbaric violence. What we do know is what happened in the cold days that followed. William did not weep for the men who had spent their lives trying to erase his birthright. More importantly, he actively blocked every single effort to prosecute the ringleaders of the mob. He completely shielded the murderers from justice. Later, he quietly rewarded several of them with state pensions and civic titles. He may not have ordered the blade to fall, but he was ruthless enough to protect the hands that held it. With the De Witt brothers gone, William methodically purged the provincial councils. He swept away the old Republican Guard and replaced them with men whose loyalty to the House of Orange was absolute. The government was his, the army was his, the legacy of his father was finally restored. He had spent his entire childhood as a hostage to the state, and now he was its undisputed master. But what good is a restored legacy if your kingdom is underwater? The young prince did not get a single day to enjoy his triumph. He could not return to a quiet palace or celebrate his sudden, staggering ascent. Because the sea was still rising, and the army of the most powerful king on earth was still standing on Dutch soil. A bride from the enemy. With the government firmly under his control, William turned his attention back to the flooded landscape. He did not fight the French by marching straight into their massed cannons. Instead, he methodically struck at their supply lines. He pushed south toward Maastricht. By 1673, he was marching his army all the way to the west bank of the River Rhine around Cologne. This unexpected aggression forced King Louis to pull his troops out of Dutch territory just to defend his own flanks. Meanwhile, the young stadholder worked tirelessly in the shadows. He forged a grand military alliance with the Austrian Habsburgs, Spain and Brandenburg-Prussia to contain the French threat. By 1674, he had clawed back nearly all of the provinces lost during the disaster year. His popularity among the common people was absolute. Eager to reward their saviour, the government offered to make him the Duke of Gelderland and the Count of Zutphen. He refused. He knew that taking aristocratic titles would only inflame the old republican suspicions lingering in Amsterdam. It is a deeply revealing detail. The man who would one day cross an ocean to accept the crown of England flatly rejected a dukedom in his own homeland, all to keep his fragile coalition intact. But William's greatest victory that year was not won on the muddy battlefields. It was won in diplomacy. He successfully knocked England out of the war. The English Parliament had never supported the conflict. They were deeply suspicious of the secret alliance King Charles II had signed with France, a shadowy treaty that contained a hidden clause, promising Charles would eventually convert to Catholicism. When Parliament realised the war was stalling, they simply cut the king's funding. In February 1674, the Treaty of Westminster was signed. It officially brought an end to nearly a quarter century of bitter, exhausting conflict, closing the book on 3 separate Anglo-Dutch wars that had raged across the sea since 1652. But the end of hostilities was only the first step. The 2 rival nations now turned to face France together, and the cement chosen for this new alliance was a marriage. William was to marry Mary Stuart, the daughter of James, Duke of York. She was the niece of King Charles, the second in line to the English throne, and William's own first cousin, as his mother was Mary's aunt. She was only 15 years old. We have already seen the tears she shed at the altar. To William, this wedding was not a matter of the heart, for how can a man who has spent his entire life fighting for survival afford the luxury of romance? To him, she was simply a calculated manoeuvre on the vast chessboard of Europe. By 1676, the war had bogged down into a grueling, bloody stalemate in the Spanish Netherlands. Armies bled over fortress towns like Valenciennes, Cambrai, and Saint-Omer. Neither side could make a decisive breakthrough, and tentative peace talks began in the Dutch town of Nijmegen. It was William's marriage in November 1677, combined with the impending threat of a fully realised Anglo-Dutch military alliance, that finally forced King Louis to the table. The Peace of Nijmegen was finalised in the late summer of 1678. The borders of the Dutch Republic remained largely unchanged, but France carved out new territories in the Spanish Netherlands, establishing the northeastern French border that still exists today. For William, the treaty carried a deeply personal victory. Louis formally ceded him full ownership of the Principality of Orange in southern France. It was a massive political concession, one that solidified William's status, not just as a Dutch official, but as a quasi-royal prince on the European stage. For the first time in his life, William entered a sustained period of peace. His marriage, despite the 12-year age gap and its cold political origins, found a quiet, functioning rhythm. The two were bound together by a deep, shared Protestant piety. Yet, the halls of their palaces remained terribly quiet. Mary suffered at least one miscarriage in the early years of their marriage, and it soon became devastatingly clear that there would be no children to inherit the dynasty. William spent the 1680s doing what he did best. He waited, and he prepared. He quietly wove new alliances across the continent, certain that another war with France was inevitable. He opened the borders of the Republic to French Huguenots, Protestants who were fleeing in a mass exodus after Louis revoked their right to worship. Thousands found refuge in the Netherlands, and some even sailed as far as the Dutch Cape Colony in southern Africa. The young prince watched the horizon, his entire life oriented toward the south. Every treaty he signed, every army he funded, and every alliance he built was designed for one singular purpose: to contain the ambitions of the French king. But history rarely attacks from the direction you are watching. All of William's careful calculations were pointed at Paris. Yet the event that would completely upend his life and reshape the entire world was quietly brewing to the west. In the homeland of his wife. An invitation in cipher. In 1673, the English Parliament passed the Test Act, a law requiring all military and civil officials to formally declare their religious allegiances. In doing so, they dragged a terrifying secret into the light of day. King Charles's brother, James, the Duke of York, was a Roman Catholic. A frantic political effort known as the Exclusion Crisis followed in the late 1670s, designed to block James from the line of succession. But the effort failed. When Charles II died in February of 1685, his brother ascended the throne as King James. The Protestant elite watched in quiet terror as their new king began actively favouring Catholics across England and Ireland, methodically dismantling Protestant privileges. Yet, the political class consoled themselves with a simple biological calculation. James was 51 years old and had no legitimate son. His heir was his Protestant daughter Mary, living safely across the sea in The Hague. The king's opponents whispered to one another that they only needed to endure him for a little while. The reign would be short. The natural order would eventually restore itself. But in June of 1688, that entire calculation collapsed in a single day. The king's Catholic wife, Mary of Modena, gave birth to a healthy baby boy. The birth of a male heir meant that Mary was instantly pushed down the line of succession. A new, unbroken Catholic dynasty had materialised overnight, and it threatened to undo everything the English Reformation had achieved over the previous century. Almost immediately, a desperate conspiracy theory began to spread through the foggy streets of London. Men whispered that the baby was an impostor, smuggled into the Queen's bedchamber inside a warming pan. It was a vicious, baseless rumour backed by absolutely no physical evidence. But for a terrified political class staring down the barrel of a Catholic monarchy, it was exactly the justification they needed to commit treason. On the 30th of June, 1688, 7 powerful men met in secret, likely hidden away at the London townhouse of the Earl of Shrewsbury. They drafted a dangerous letter to William of Orange. They signed it in numerical cipher to protect their identities from the king's spies. Among them were Charles Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, William Cavendish, the Earl of Devonshire, Thomas Osborne, the Earl of Danby, and Henry Compton, the Bishop of London. Authored by Henry Sidney, the letter pleaded with William to cross the sea and intervene. Translating their encrypted desperation, they wrote that they believed they would be in a worse condition every passing day, and increasingly less able to defend themselves. They earnestly wished to find a remedy before it was too late to contribute to their own deliverance. History often remembers this moment as a desperate rescue, an English cry for help answered by a noble Dutch prince. But William of Orange was not a romantic hero. He was a cold, calculating battlefield commander, and he did not launch a massive naval invasion simply because he received a letter. In truth, William had already begun quietly assembling his army and his fleet in the spring of 1688, months before the encrypted invitation ever reached his desk. To him, the English throne was not a personal prize, nor was it a tragic family dispute. It was simply an untouched arsenal of men, ships, and money. He desperately needed the immense resources of England to fight the French, and the birth of a Catholic prince merely gave him the perfect political excuse to seize them. In early November, William landed in the southwest of England with 20,000 troops. What followed was a masterclass in military intimidation. There was almost no fighting. The English army and navy simply refused to engage the invader. As his forces marched steadily on London, King James was captured trying to flee the country. Many expected William to imprison or execute the fallen monarch. Instead, William deliberately ordered his guards to step aside and let James escape to France. He knew that a martyred king would inspire an endless rebellion. For what is more dangerous to a conqueror than the blood of a martyr? But a king who abandoned his own kingdom in the night would simply be forgotten. This swift, largely bloodless coup became known as the Glorious Revolution. But securing the country was only the first step. The English Parliament, exhausted by the heavy hand of absolute monarchs, sought to permanently clip the wings of the crown before they handed it over to a foreigner. They drafted the Declaration of Right, which would later be formalised as the Bill of Rights. It strictly forbade the king from levying taxes or maintaining a standing army without Parliament's explicit consent. There was also the critical question of who would actually rule. The legal right to the throne belonged solely to Mary, and many in Parliament preferred her to be the sole monarch, with William acting merely as a royal consort. William's response was characteristically cold and absolute. He flatly declared that he was no man's lieutenant. If he was not made a reigning king with actual power, he would pack up his army and return to Holland, leaving them to face the wrath of James and the French alone. Parliament had no choice but to fold. William and Mary were declared joint monarchs. For the Dutch stadholder, the political manoeuvring was over. He now had exactly what he had crossed the ocean to get. He had the English crown, he had the English treasury, he had the Royal Navy. And almost at that exact moment, King Louis XIV of France formally declared war. For William of Orange, this was not a disaster. It was a grimly satisfying opportunity. This was the massive continental war he had been waiting for. The very war he had just stolen a kingdom to fight. The defence of Europe was the only thing that truly mattered to him, and it was exactly the thing that would consume every remaining day of his life. The river in Ireland. The 9 Years' War had begun. The continent was engulfed in the conflict William had spent his entire life preparing for, yet almost immediately he was forced to look away. In March of 1689, the deposed King James landed in Ireland with French troops. Richard Talbot, the Earl of Tyrconnell, held Dublin, and a Catholic Parliament began preparing to reverse decades of Protestant land settlements. But to William, Ireland was merely a sideshow. He initially believed the entire campaign was nothing more than a strategic decoy engineered by King Louis to drag him away from the vital battlefields of the Low Countries. He sent his trusted commander, the Duke of Schomberg, in August, but the campaign immediately bogged down. A brutal autumn and winter, driven by the freezing temperatures of the late Little Ice Age, brought widespread disease and starvation to the camps. Meanwhile, the failed siege of Londonderry secured the northern province of Ulster for William's forces, giving him a crucial foothold. But it was clear that his generals could not finish the job alone. On the 14th of June 1690, William landed at Carrickfergus, near Belfast, to take command himself. The two armies met at the River Boyne on the 1st of July. The reality of the battle is often overshadowed by its towering legacy. It was a profoundly uneven fight. William fielded roughly 35,000 men, including highly trained Dutch regiments, against 24,000 French and Irish troops, many of whom were poorly equipped irregulars. The fighting was fierce but relatively contained. Total casualties for both sides combined numbered only about 2,000 men. Crucially, the French and Irish forces were not decisively routed. They withdrew in good order toward Dublin, preserving the core of their army. And the victory cost William dearly. as the Duke of Schomberg was killed in the chaos of a cavalry charge. Militarily, the Battle of the Boyne was not a definitive end to the war. Even the date we remember is a puzzle of history. The battle was fought on July the 1st under the old Julian calendar, which translates to July the 11th under the modern Gregorian calendar. Yet, it is commemorated today on the 12th of July. This discrepancy arose when Britain synchronised its calendars in the mid-18th century, resulting in inconsistent conversions. Furthermore, historians still argue about the true origin of the July 12th commemoration. Some believe that the Boyne simply absorbed the memory of a different engagement, the Battle of Aughrim, which genuinely fell on the 12th of July under the old calendar and was the truly decisive clash of the war. What we do know is that the Orange Order, the fraternal organisation that champions William's legacy, was not founded until 1795, more than a century after the battle itself. The immense political meaning of the battle was constructed long after the smoke had cleared. In the immediate aftermath, William made a profound political miscalculation. He issued the Declaration of Finglas, offering a full pardon to the ordinary soldiers and civilian supporters of James if they surrendered within 2 weeks, but he explicitly excluded Catholic landlords and military officers from the amnesty. With their lands and lives still forfeit, the Jacobite leadership had absolutely no reason to surrender. They dug in, and the war would drag on for another agonising year. But William would not be there to fight it. Almost immediately after the Boyne, he received terrifying news. On the 10th of July, the French Navy had crushed the Allied English and Dutch fleets at the Battle of Beachy Head. William rushed back to London. For what did Ireland matter if the French controlled the sea lanes to his homeland? It is a detail that proves his singular motivation. He was not fighting to destroy the father-in-law he had just deposed. He was fighting to stop King Louis. He left his Dutch commander, Godert de Ginkle, to finish the Irish campaign. Ginkle secured the definitive military victory at Aughrim on July the 12th, 1691, and soon after captured Galway and Limerick. The Treaty of Limerick finally brought the war in Ireland to a close, allowing the remnants of James's army to sail freely to France. But the consolidation of William's new kingdoms was not without its dark stains. In Scotland, the Highland clans were ordered to swear an oath of allegiance to both William and Mary by the end of 1691. The MacDonalds of Glencoe were late in registering their oath. On the 13th of February 1692, government troops, who had been billeted with the clan, turned on their hosts in the early hours of the morning. 38 men were killed on the spot. Approximately 40 women and children died of exposure in the freezing winter after their homes were burned to the ground. History once again demands a careful accounting. William did sign the orders authorising the troops to extirpate the clan, but the orders were drafted and aggressively pushed by his Scottish secretary, the Master of Stair. Historians still debate the degree to which William actually understood the brutality of what he was signing. Some argue he was a distant king rubber-stamping a bureaucratic document. Others insist a military commander of his calibre knew exactly what the word extirpate meant. Twice in 20 years, men had been slaughtered in his name, and twice he had walked away without facing the judgment of the law. But the truth is, William rarely let his mind linger on the snows of Scotland or the rivers of Ireland. They were simply troubled provinces on the edge of the map, distractions he had to neutralise. The young prince who had grown up in the shadow of a republic was now the king of 3 nations. He had an army, a navy, and the revenue of 3 kingdoms. He had never wanted any of it for its own sake. What he was actually fighting for. He had never wanted the crown of England for its own sake. It was only ever a means to an end. With the vast financial and naval resources of his new kingdom secured, William turned all of his formidable energy back to the continent. He spent the early 1690s expanding his coalition into something entirely unprecedented in European history. The Grand Alliance now took in the three Stuart kingdoms, the Dutch Republic, the Austrian Habsburgs, and Spain. It reached as far as the Duchy of Savoy, straddling the mountain border between France and Italy. Even the distant powers of Sweden and Denmark offered their sporadic support. Building and maintaining this sprawling, fragile network was his true life's work. King Louis responded with a massive, two-pronged strategy. He ordered his armies deep into the Spanish Netherlands, where they found considerable tactical success. At the same time, he prepared a naval invasion of southern England. The aim was to put James back on the throne. But the invasion never came. The combined might of the English and Dutch navies intercepted and engaged the French fleet at the battles of Barfleur and La Hougue in the spring of 1692. The French fleet was destroyed. With it went any hope France had of ever landing an army on English soil. Despite protecting them from a devastating French invasion, William was never loved by the English people. He was quiet, severe, and chronically ill with asthma, lacking the easy charm they expected from their monarchs. To the political elite in London, he was simply a Dutch interloper who heavily favoured his foreign advisers. Several prominent politicians even maintained secret, treasonous communications with the exiled King James in France, carefully hedging their bets in case the winds of power shifted again. It was his wife, Mary, who effectively managed the restless government and crushed the domestic plots while William was away fighting on the continent. She was the English face of the monarchy, and she was the vital anchor of his reign. And then he lost her. On the 28th of December, 1694, Mary died of smallpox. For a man who kept his emotions so fiercely guarded, the loss completely broke him. William suffered a physical and mental collapse so severe that he could not even find the strength to attend her funeral. He never remarried. Her death not only devastated him personally, but it left him terribly exposed politically. He had lost the woman who provided the very legal foundation for his throne, and they had no children to secure the fragile dynasty. He was a foreign king ruling alone over a deeply suspicious nation. Yet William simply kept fighting. In September of 1695, he took back the heavily fortified city of Namur from the French. It gave him control of both banks of the River Meuse. That same year, the Duc de Luxembourg, King Louis's most brilliant and successful general, died. The strategic momentum slowly began to shift. It was becoming clear in the halls of Paris that the war could not be won in the overwhelming, rapid fashion Louis had originally envisioned. Desperation naturally bred dangerous plots. In early 1696, a sophisticated conspiracy to assassinate William was exposed. Led by George Berkeley and Sir John Fenwick, the plot aimed to ambush and murder the king as he returned from a hunt. But the conspiracy spectacularly backfired. The shock of the assassination attempt galvanized the English public. In a strange twist of fate, the threat on his life made William genuinely popular among his subjects for the very first time. By the late autumn of 1697, Europe was financially and militarily exhausted. The warring powers finally gathered in a Dutch town to sign the Treaty of Ryswick. If you look at the treaty purely through the lens of geography, the 9 Years' War appears almost entirely pointless. The borders of Europe were largely reset to exactly where they had been before the conflict began, with only a few minor territorial swaps. 9 years of unimaginable blood, starvation and treasure had seemingly bought nothing. But what William truly demanded at the negotiating table was not drawn on a map. He demanded that King Louis formally recognise him as the legitimate King of England, Scotland and Ireland. Furthermore, Louis had to publicly and permanently abandon his support for the exiled King James. Louis accepted the terms, and in that quiet moment of diplomacy, the central thesis of William's entire life was fulfilled. He had not invaded England to steal a crown for his own vanity. He had taken it so that he could force the most powerful monarch in the world to sign a piece of paper acknowledging it. That signature was the only prize he had ever wanted. He had forced his greatest enemy to bend. He had secured the borders of his homeland and locked the Stuart kingdoms firmly into his grand alliance. For what general could ask for a more complete victory? But William was a king without an heir, and he was not the only one. Across the Pyrenees, the severely ill and childless King of Spain was slowly dying, and the terrifying question of who would inherit the vast Spanish Empire was about to pull William, and all of Europe, into one final apocalyptic war. The little gentleman in the black velvet waistcoat. He knew the time he had left was running out. In June of 1701, William signed a piece of legislation that would shape Britain forever. The Act of Settlement. It dictated that his sister-in-law, Anne, would succeed him. If she died without surviving children, the crown would bypass dozens of closer Catholic relatives and pass to the House of Hanover in Germany. These were the Protestant descendants of King James I's daughter, Elizabeth Stuart, who had married the Elector Palatine in 1613. More importantly, the Act contained a permanent constitutional clause. It stated that no Catholic could ever again sit on the English throne. The agonising crisis of 1685 would never repeat itself. He had legally secured the Protestant succession, but he could not secure the peace. In November of 1700, King Charles II of Spain died at the age of 38, leaving no children. His health had been poor his entire life. Historians attribute much of it to generations of close intermarriage within the Habsburg dynasty. With his final breath, the Spanish Habsburg line went extinct. In his will, he left the entirety of the vast global Spanish Empire to Philippe, the Duke of Anjou. Philippe was the grandson of King Louis XIV. The implications were apocalyptic. If France absorbed Spain and its colonies, Louis would command a power no alliance in Europe could match. William threw himself into desperate diplomacy throughout 1700 and 1701, obsessed with his lifelong goal. As he worked to rebuild his coalition, he found himself forced to speak two very different political languages. To the Dutch, he spoke urgently of securing their southern borders against a direct French invasion. The English cared little for European land wars. To them he had to speak of trade and of French ships in North America, the Caribbean, and India. Despite his efforts, the diplomatic negotiations ultimately collapsed. Then Louis made a fatal error. He formally recognised the exiled son of James as the legitimate King of England. It tore up the signature William had spent 9 years bleeding for at Ryswick. James himself died that same year. In July of 1701, the War of the Spanish Succession broke out, dragging the continent back into the fire. But William would only live to see its first 7 months. On the 20th of February 1702, the king was riding in the park at Hampton Court. He was mounted on a relatively new horse named Sorrel. As they moved at a steady pace through the grass, the horse stumbled on a small mound of earth. William was thrown violently to the ground, breaking his right collarbone upon impact. A physician was immediately summoned to set the bone on the spot. But William, stubborn and unwilling to show weakness, insisted on returning to Kensington Palace by carriage that very evening. The heavy jolting of the carriage over the rough roads misaligned the freshly set bone. A week later it became obvious that the fracture had not healed. His right arm began to swell, and a deep, exhausting fever set in. His body, already fragile and worn down by a lifetime of campaigning, could not fight it. He developed severe pneumonia, a lethal complication for a man who had suffered from crippling asthma and chronic lung disease since his youth. He died on the 8th of March, 1702. His body lay in state for several weeks. When the funeral was finally held on the 12th of April, it was an incredibly quiet and subdued affair for a reigning English monarch. William had asked for a modest ceremony, and the English political class had never stopped seeing him as a cold, foreign interloper. He was buried in the royal vaults of Westminster Abbey, quietly laid to rest beside Mary. When evaluating his life, the ledger is remarkably mixed. Contemporaries and modern historians alike rank him as a mediocre military commander. Many of his greatest battlefield victories were actually engineered by far more capable generals, like Godet de Ginkle. As a politician, he was equally limited, never managing to win the true affection of his adopted nation. Morally, he was profoundly ruthless. The blood of the DeWitt brothers and the freezing deaths at Glencoe remain permanent stains on his character. Yet, in exactly one thing, William of Orange was wildly, historically successful. He stopped King Louis XIV. Because of William, the Dutch Republic was not wiped from the map. King James did not return to London as a French puppet, and the massive, pan-European alliance he built would go on, long after his death, to prevent the Spanish Empire from being swallowed whole by France. He laid the geopolitical groundwork that allowed Britain to rise as a global superpower in the 18th century. For how could the modern world have taken shape if he had simply surrendered in the disaster year? In the weeks after his death, the exiled Jacobites drinking in the taverns of France began to raise a strange new toast. They lifted their glasses and drank to the health of the little gentleman in the black velvet waistcoat. They were toasting the mole. For 30 years he had stood immovable in front of the greatest war machine in Europe. He was brought down by a mound of dirt in a park. Today, the king lies buried in the dark, quiet royal vaults of Westminster Abbey. He rests directly beside his wife, Queen Mary, though she was placed in that cold stone 7 years before him. Yet everything William achieved in England was borrowed from her. The landing, the crown, the very legal right to sit on that throne. The story you have just heard belongs to the man who borrowed the power. But the story you are about to hear belongs to the woman who surrendered it. A dying queen is refusing to let her only living sister into the room. It is late December 1694, inside the sealed, hushed walls of Kensington Palace. Mary II is 32 years old and she is losing to smallpox. Her doctors have given up hope. Across the city, her younger sister Princess Anne has written to beg for a visit. Anne says she will accept any risk at all just to see her sister one last time. Mary sends her firm refusal back through a servant. There will be no final meeting. It looks heartless. It is the opposite. Anne is heavily pregnant. She has never had smallpox, and she has no immunity to the disease now tearing through the palace. To let her into the room would be to sign a death warrant for both the princess and her unborn child. But beneath that medical reality lies a much deeper, quieter tragedy. The two sisters have not spoken a single word to one another in 2 years. Because of this locked door, they never will again. And this is the second family Mary has had to take apart. 6 years earlier, she helped take a throne from the hands of her own father. Welcome to yesterday's voices, where history is spoken. It is easy to look back at the glorious revolution and see only a military conquest, a cold chess move, executed by a Dutch prince. But that narrative ignores the woman standing at the very centre of the storm. In the chaotic winter of 1688, Mary was the only person in the entire coup who possessed a legitimate, undeniable legal right to the English succession. Without her royal blood, William of Orange was nothing more than a foreign invader with a large army. He had no legal standing, he had no legitimate claim. Parliament hesitated. Many members wanted to make her sole monarch and reduce him to a consort. It was Mary who declared she would never accept the crown alone. She insisted she would only rule jointly alongside her husband. She said this at the exact moment William was threatening to abandon the country and sail home if he was not made a king with real, independent power. Historians have never agreed on what was in her mind. Some read genuine conviction. Others read cold political arithmetic. Others say she had no real choice at all. What is certain is the outcome. She handed him 3 kingdoms. Because the true price Mary paid was never the throne. The throne was merely an object made of gold and velvet, a heavy burden she never desired. The real price was extracted in human collateral. It was the permanent, heartbreaking destruction of her relationship with her father, who viewed her as a traitor. It was the bitter, silent estrangement from her only sister. And it was the quiet, echoing emptiness of the royal nurseries, waiting for the children who never came. She traded her family for the stability of a fragile nation. But how do you live in a court full of strangers, wearing a crown you never wanted, among the ghosts of everyone you left behind? 8 children and 2 survivors. Mary was born on the 30th of April 1662 within the grand, red brick walls of St James's Palace in London. She was the eldest surviving daughter of James, the Duke of York, and the niece of the reigning English monarch, King Charles II. Her mother was Anne Hyde, a woman of sharp intelligence. Anne was the daughter of the Earl of Clarendon, who served as the most powerful political minister in the government throughout the 1660s. At the exact moment of her birth, King Charles had no legitimate children of his own. This made James the direct, immediate heir to the throne, and the infant Mary second in line. But no one in London believed she would stay there for long. Everyone at court assumed the king would soon have a child of his own with his new royal bride, Catherine of Braganza. But that child never came. Mary's entire life would revolve around one simple, heavy fact. Her uncle's royal nurseries remained empty, and every tragedy she endured was tied to that silence. She was named Mary in direct honour of her great-great-grandmother, Mary Queen of Scots. It was a name steeped in religious rebellion. Her parents had both been raised in the Protestant faith, but their long years of political exile in France and the Spanish Netherlands had exposed them to Catholicism. The choice of her name was a quiet, early signal of where their private hearts were turning. Eventually, both James and Anne would secretly convert. But King Charles II was a ruthless pragmatist. He knew that the English people would never tolerate the prospect of a Catholic monarch. He issued an absolute decree. No matter what her parents believed behind closed doors, James's children were to be raised strictly in the Church of England. Mary was raised as a devout, unshakable Protestant. It was a faith she would cling to for the rest of her life, and the single decision that would eventually tear her family apart. Like most royal children of the era, Mary was not raised by the parents who brought her into the world. She was sent away to live in her own separate household at Richmond Palace, far from the intrigues of the capital. Her daily life was overseen by a governess, Lady Frances Villiers. She was the wife of Edward Villiers, and she quickly became the closest maternal figure the young girl had. There, surrounded by tutors and ladies-in-waiting, Mary was taught how to be a princess. She studied the Greco-Roman classics, she practiced music and intricate dancing, and she became fluent in conversational French. But it was a lonely existence, made even stranger by the open realities of the royal court. Her father maintained a long-standing, very public affair with a woman named Arabella Churchill. Between 1667 and 1674, Arabella gave birth to several of James's illegitimate children. There was a cruel, undeniable biological irony at play. While the children born to the king's brother in lawful wedlock were tragically fragile, the illegitimate children born to Arabella were overwhelmingly healthy. They survived safely to adulthood, and they were eventually given aristocratic titles. They grew up around the edges of the court, where everyone knew exactly who they were. Mary knew they were her blood, for how does a young girl make sense of such a world? The rightful heirs wither in the nursery, while the illegitimate children thrive in the sun. To understand Mary's childhood, you must understand the silence of her own family's nursery. Anne Hyde gave birth to 8 children in total. Only 2 survived. The losses came in a relentless, exhausting rhythm that cast a permanent shadow over the household. The first boy, Charles, died of smallpox at just 7 months old before Mary was even born. Then came James, a little boy who lived to be almost 4. He fell victim to the last great plague that swept through England in the summer of 1667. Only weeks before he died, another infant named Charles succumbed to sudden convulsions. A baby girl named Henrietta died at 10 months old in 1669. Little Edgar lived to be 3, passing away just 10 weeks after his mother, and Catherine, who was born only 7 weeks before her mother's death, died before her first birthday. Their mother, Anne Hyde, died in late March of 1671. She had been suffering privately for years, almost certainly from an advanced breast cancer. Her long, smouldering illness likely contributed to the tragic fragility of the children she carried in her final years. By the time the soil finally settled, out of 8 children, only Mary and her younger sister Anne remained. The 2 girls clung to one another in the echoing halls of Richmond Palace. They were bound together by the shared trauma of a vanishing family. They relied on each other because there was no one else left. They were inseparable, but they were walking a path that would one day fracture, sending the 2 sisters in different, devastating directions. By 1671, Mary was a 10-year-old girl who had just watched her mother and 5 of her siblings lowered into the earth. She had only one true blood relative left in the world who shared her isolated life. For now, she was just a grieving child in a quiet palace. But in only a few short years, the men who ran the continent would pull her out of the shadows and play her as a diplomatic card. Dearest, dearest, dear husband. Her name was Frances Apsley, and she was born in 1653. She was the daughter of Sir Alan Apsley, a prominent royalist. He had been a loyal cavalry officer during the brutal civil war of the 1640s. He was richly rewarded for his steadfast loyalty when the monarchy was finally restored. He had even served at sea under Mary's own father during the fierce Anglo-Dutch War of the mid-1660s. In the early 1670s, Frances was formally appointed as a maid of honour in the royal household. She was assigned to serve both Mary and her younger sister, Anne, at Richmond Palace. The palace was a beautiful but isolated place, and the 2 young princesses were surrounded by adults who were paid to watch them. Frances was nearly a full decade older than Mary, possessing a worldly confidence that must have been intoxicating to a sheltered princess. Despite the gap in their ages, the 2 formed an intense bond. Beginning around 1675, the teenage Mary began writing to her in secret. These secret letters would eventually number in the dozens. In them, Mary adopted a fascinating, highly stylized persona. She played the vivid role of a devoted wife, and she addressed Francis as her husband. She routinely opened her letters with the exact breathless greeting, "Dearest, dearest, dear husband." Mary's younger sister, Anne, also wrote remarkably similar letters to Francis. Anne also cast herself heavily in the role of a romantic partner. This created a strange, intense emotional triangle within the quiet walls of the palace. The correspondence did not stop when Mary grew up. She continued writing these fervent, aching letters even after she was married, She wrote them from across the sea while living in Holland. In one particularly striking letter, Mary wrote that she loved Francis more than anything in the world. How are we supposed to read these intimate letters today? Historians still argue fiercely about how to interpret this. Some believe the letters are exactly what they appear to be. They read the correspondence as quiet, undeniable evidence of an intense emotional life. It was a life that the rigid 17th century had no room to accommodate. According to this view, the letters are the desperate outlet of a girl who was trapped. Others insist on a much more contextual reading. They point out that this kind of highly passionate, dramatic language was actually quite common among aristocratic women of the era. Furthermore, the letters are densely packed with direct references to popular characters from the 17th century London stage. It is highly possible that the royal sisters were simply borrowing theatrical roles. They might have been playing a sophisticated emotional game of courtly make-believe. The letters could be the exaggerated romantic prose of teenagers experimenting with language. What we do know is that modern scholarship has largely moved past this binary debate. Recent studies have abandoned the modern urge to neatly label these relationships. Instead, they read the letters as a rare window into the passionate friendships of the era. They reveal the intricate, vital networks of female political alliances within the royal court. In that isolated, heavily scrutinized world, private affection and political power were completely inseparable. The truth is that we will almost certainly never know exactly what Mary felt. Modern historians remain sharply divided on the complicated subject, but taking the rigid concepts of the 21st century and forcing them onto a 17th century teenage girl is a mistake. Doing so usually says much more about our modern anxieties than it ever says about her. It reduces a complex, historical human being to a modern talking point. Whatever her true, private feelings for Francis Apsley were, they could not change her reality. Mary was a royal princess, and she was the eldest niece of the King of England. The prospect of her being married off to some European nobleman was never an open question. It was a certainty, and everyone around her knew it. She was treated as a biological asset of the state, and her personal feelings were entirely irrelevant to the survival of the crown. She was a piece on a European chessboard, waiting to be moved. By the middle of the 1670s, the political pressure surrounding her had reached a boiling point. Her uncle, King Charles II, still had no legitimate children of his own. Mary remained dangerously close to the throne. She was the ultimate prize in a shifting web of continental alliances. The only question left was who she would be forced to marry, and the terrifying answer to that question would decide which side of the escalating European conflict England would finally take. The Bride Who Cried. There were really only two serious candidates for the princess's hand in marriage. Choosing between them meant choosing the entire foreign policy of the English nation. The stakes of this choice could not have been higher for the future of Europe. The French king was already the most terrifying military force on the entire continent. If England allied with France, the balance of power would be permanently destroyed. If England allied with Holland, the Dutch would finally have the naval support they desperately needed. The first candidate was the Grand Dauphin Louis. He was the eldest son and direct heir of King Louis XIV of France, and he was extremely close to Mary in age. The second candidate was William of Orange, the battle-hardened Dutch stadholder, who was already over 25 years old. Marrying France meant that England would officially lean toward the French king. Marrying Holland meant blocking French military expansion into the Low Countries and Western Germany. This was a massive, calculated geopolitical decision, dressed up in a royal wedding gown. In 1677, The English court finally chose Holland, and Mary was simply informed of the diplomatic decision. Nobody asked her, "What is it like to learn the shape of the rest of your life from a courtier reading out someone else's arithmetic?" Absolutely no one in the government asked for her opinion. The historic royal wedding took place on the 4th of November in 1677. It was held securely behind the heavily guarded walls of St James's Palace in London. The wedding took place at 9 o'clock at night. The atmosphere in the palace was notoriously tense and devoid of any real joy. Mary had wept continuously for 2 straight days leading up to the ceremony. The ceremony was officiated by Henry Compton, the powerful Bishop of London. He is a figure worth remembering, for Compton would reappear at the most consequential turning points of her entire life. The groom turned 27 years old on the exact day of the wedding, and he was also her first cousin. Later that evening, King Charles II personally supervised the traditional royal bedding ceremony. He was the man who had arranged the political marriage, and he saw it to its physical conclusion. Relatives and servants formally led the newlyweds into their bedchamber to consummate the union. It was standard royal custom, observed with clinical, public precision. Royal marriages of the 17th century were often brutal affairs. There were plenty of bad signs right from the beginning of the marriage. There was a 12-year gap in their ages. The prince was known to be asthmatic, hunchbacked, and socially awkward. He lacked all the easy charm that Mary was used to seeing at the English court. Furthermore, loud and persistent rumours circulated in both England and Holland about William's private life. Whispers suggested that he harboured affections for men, as he maintained an exclusive circle of male friends. Mary walked into this complicated, highly scrutinised reality blind to the truth. But against all terrible odds, the unlikely marriage slowly became a relatively stable partnership. They were bound together by the one powerful thing they both genuinely shared. They both possessed a deep and unshakable devotion to the strict Protestant faith. Horrible winter weather kept the newly married couple trapped in London for 2 weeks. The journey across the English Channel was freezing, violent, and miserable. They finally departed in early December, arriving safely in The Hague on the 14th. They were greeted with an official entry ceremony to formally mark their arrival. Her new subjects turned out by the thousands to greet her. The streets of The Hague were lined with cheering crowds and elaborate, towering arches. The Dutch people quickly grew fond of their young, new foreign princess. She was a vibrant, beautiful princess bringing royal glamour to a merchant republic. She was the closest thing to a queen that the republic would see for many years. She had arrived in a small country that was rich. The wealth she saw in Holland rivaled anything she had ever known in London. Amsterdam and London were the absolute centres where modern capitalism took shape in the 17th century. The Dutch Republic had stock markets and joint stock companies. The Dutch East India Company was pulling riches from the other side of the world. Spices, silks, and precious metals flowed constantly into the ports of Amsterdam. Its vast colonial footprint stretched across North America, the Caribbean, Southern Africa, and the East Indies. But that wealth had bred envy across the continent. King Louis XIV was constantly manoeuvring his armies to swallow the Republic whole. That threat was the backdrop for the rest of her life. She was 15 years old, living among a people whose language she did not speak. She was married to a military commander who was almost never at home. She had crossed the sea to become the closest thing to a queen the Dutch Republic would ever have. Nobody had told her how much of that life she would spend by herself. The children who never came. In the middle of 1678, Mary travelled south to the fortified town of Breda. Her husband was stationed there, desperately organising the military defences of the Dutch Republic. the Dutch were bracing for a new wave of brutal French military raids across their borders. While staying in the austere military encampment, Mary fell suddenly and violently ill. She suffered a devastating, traumatic miscarriage. The exact medical timeline of the next 3 years remains unclear today. Historical records from the 17th century are blurred on matters of women's health. We know that she fell seriously ill 2 more times, in 1679 and 1680. These illnesses were accompanied by high fevers and severe physical exhaustion. Most historians generally assume that at least one of these illnesses was another painful miscarriage, but we do not know for sure, and we must not invent medical certainties where none exist. What we do know is that severe complications from these early pregnancies caused permanent internal damage. They seem to have permanently destroyed her physical ability to ever bear healthy children. Throughout the 1680s, Mary continued to express a quiet, desperate hope for a child. She wrote letters expressing her longing to finally become a mother, but the royal nurseries in Holland remained empty for the rest of her life. The true, crushing weight of this tragedy was not confined to her private grief. Mary was a devout Protestant princess. She was standing second in line to the throne of 3 different kingdoms. Without an heir to secure the lineage, the entire religious balance of the British Isles hung suspended over a terrifying void. For how can a woman mourn the quiet loss of a child when her barrenness is treated as a terrifying crisis of the state? Her personal, physical pain was immediately transformed into a geopolitical problem. William was frequently absent during these difficult, isolating years in the Dutch Republic. He was constantly riding out on arduous military campaigns to hold off the advancing French armies. He spent months away from his wife, living in military tents and directing sieges. Yet, against all odds, the marriage slowly solidified into a genuine working partnership. They were anchored by a shared, unshakable devotion to the strict Protestant faith, and while her husband was away fighting, the Dutch people learned to love her. She provided a comforting, royal presence in a country exhausted by endless continental warfare. But Mary's life was never going to be allowed to remain peacefully in Holland. The political storm that would eventually swallow her was already gathering back across the Channel. In 1673, the English Parliament had passed a piece of legislation called the Test Act. This law forced all public officials to openly declare their true religious faith and take Anglican communion. Her father's Catholicism had been carefully hidden for years because he knew how dangerous it was. Now, it was sudden, undeniable public knowledge that sent shockwaves through the entire English government. This sudden religious revelation collided violently with a looming dynastic disaster. King Charles II's marriage to Catherine of Braganza had produced no legitimate heir. Catherine had suffered 3 tragic miscarriages early in their long marriage. Meanwhile, the king fathered well over a dozen illegitimate children with various royal mistresses. These included aristocratic women like Barbara Palmer and Catherine Pegg, as well as famous stage actresses like Nell Gwyn and Moll Davis. Historians today still cannot agree on exactly how many children the king actually fathered. It is highly likely that Charles himself did not actually know the true total number. Desperate politicians loudly urged the king to officially divorce Catherine and remarry. They demanded he produce a legitimate Protestant heir to secure the fragile nation against Catholic rule. King Charles refused to abandon his wife. He kept Catherine safely by his side until the day he finally died. Because the king refused to remarry, Parliament took drastic, unprecedented action in the late 1670s. They launched a fierce political campaign to exclude James from the royal succession over his religion. They argued that a Catholic monarch would inevitably destroy the liberties of Protestant England. This unstable period became formally known as the Dangerous Exclusion Crisis. Charles and James fought back relentlessly against the hostile, aggressive Parliament. By 1681, they had successfully fended off the challenge. Her father's rightful position as the immediate heir to the throne was finally legally secured. But a terrifying political seed had already been planted in the minds of the English people. From her quiet palaces in Holland, Mary looked across the water toward her distant homeland. She saw a very simple, seemingly irreversible political reality. As long as her father lived and had no son, she was the next Protestant Queen of England. Both halves of that terrifying sentence were about to change. A letter she could not answer. King Charles II died in February of 1685, and his brother ascended to the throne. Within months, King James made his ultimate political intentions clear. He began placing Catholics in high government positions, and he moved to dismantle Protestant privileges across England and Ireland. The Protestant majority watched with growing alarm as the new king reorganised the state. They feared a return to the religious violence that had plagued the previous century. There had already been an early sign that Mary might be used as a political tool. James Scott, the Duke of Monmouth, was the eldest illegitimate son of the late king. He was a Protestant who had lived in the Low Countries for several years. While in The Hague, Mary and William had treated him with immense public honour. They had hosted the man as if he were a true, legitimate royal prince. He was given a prominent place at their court, and he was treated as family. In the summer of 1685, Monmouth landed in southwest England and launched a rebellion against the crown. The uprising was poorly organised and attracted very few armed followers. It was crushed in a matter of weeks, and Monmouth was executed for treason on the 15th of July. Mary and William immediately distanced themselves from the failed rebellion. They sent letters affirming their loyalty to the reigning monarch in London. But their prior hospitality toward Monmouth had sent a quiet, undeniable signal. It suggested an ambiguous stance toward her father's new crown, and English politicians took note. Despite the religious tension in London, a diplomatic escape route still existed. Before the summer of 1688, politicians on all sides clung to one biological fact. King James was already in his 50s and had no legitimate son. Mary remained his immediate heir, so Protestant England had to wait for an aging king to die. The prospect of Mary taking the throne kept a fragile peace across the three kingdoms. Then, in June of 1688, Mary of Modena gave birth to a healthy boy. The child was named James Francis Edward, and his birth instantly pushed Mary out of the line of succession. More importantly, the boy would almost certainly be raised as a Catholic. The fragile peace built around Mary's eventual succession evaporated overnight. Immediately, rumours began to spread through the streets of London that the baby was an impostor. Pamphlets claimed the infant had been smuggled into the Queen's bedchamber in a warming pan. It was an unverified conspiracy theory that spread across the country in days. The story lacked hard evidence, but it was useful as a political weapon. It provided a narrative that allowed angry citizens to reject the new Catholic heir. The letter those 7 men signed on the 30th of June was carried across the water in secret, and in the weeks that followed it reached The Hague. The message officially invited William to intervene in English affairs with a military force, but the letter used Mary's royal blood as the legal foundation for the entire enterprise. It explicitly cited the warming pan conspiracy theory as the justification for her claim to the throne. It placed the burden of a revolution squarely in her hands. Historians have long argued over what Mary felt in this moment. The decision placed upon her shoulders was not a matter of deposing a political rival. It meant authorising her husband's army to enter her homeland and take her father's throne. She knew exactly what could happen to a Stuart king who was abandoned by his subjects. Her own grandfather, Charles I, had been tried and executed by his people in 1649. There was absolutely no guarantee that her father would only lose his crown. How does a daughter authorize an invasion that might end in her father's execution? She was torn, and what survives of her own writing shows a woman in real distress. There was no version of this that came out clean. In the end, her Protestant faith and her sense of duty to the state outweighed her loyalty to her father. It was a real, agonizing struggle, rather than an easy political calculation. The depth of that struggle is magnified by a letter James sent her that same year. He wrote that he firmly believed she would still be a good daughter. He believed this because he was a father who had always loved her tenderly. He appealed directly to her conscience, completely unaware of the invasion taking shape across the water. To read those words while preparing to take his kingdom requires a specific kind of endurance. When judging her choice, historians often point to the structure of her upbringing. Mary had been raised in a separate household, physically isolated from her parents from birth. She had been married off at 15 and shipped across the English Channel. By the time the letter arrived in 1688, she had been away from England for 11 years. Her primary loyalty now belonged to her husband, not to a father she had rarely lived with. She had built her entire adult life, serving as the bedrock of William's court in The Hague. The political reality of her life in Holland had slowly superseded the distant memory of her family in London. These facts do not serve as a moral excuse for her actions against her father. They provide the necessary context for how a daughter could make such a monumental decision. She agreed to the plan, and the exact moment she agreed, she ceased being the daughter of a king. She had become the legal pretext required to finally overthrow him. The crown she gave away. Mary remained safely in Holland while her husband led his army across the sea. She only crossed the English Channel after the fighting was decisively over. Her formal entry into London was a highly orchestrated, carefully managed political performance. She was specifically instructed to appear cheerful and publicly happy upon her official arrival. She was forced to smile while her deposed father was fleeing into French exile. She played the part perfectly, even as observers noted the strangeness of her public joy. The immediate political situation they faced in London was complex and delicate. Deposing King James was only legally defensible if it relied on Mary's right of succession. This required Parliament to accept the dubious premise that her newborn brother was an illegitimate impostor. But if the government accepted that premise, the legal conclusion was absolute. Under English law, Mary had to be the sole reigning queen of the nation. Without her royal bloodline, William was nothing more than a foreign invader with an army. Many prominent members of Parliament aggressively pushed for exactly that legal outcome. They wanted Mary to formally reign as the sole monarch of the three kingdoms. They proposed that William should serve merely as a regent or a royal consort. That was the cleanest, safest path through an unprecedented constitutional crisis. But William had absolutely no intention of serving as a mere royal consort. On the 3rd of February 1689, he held a private meeting with leading politicians. He flatly declared that he would return to Holland if the convention did not make him co-monarch. At the exact same time, Mary made her own political intentions perfectly clear. She sent word that she would only accept the crown if she reigned alongside her husband. Historians have never agreed on what was happening in her head during these weeks. Some read her decision as a sincere reflection of her deep Protestant faith. They argue she genuinely believed in the strict marital order of her era. Others read her choice as a piece of cold, ruthless political calculation. They argue she knew that a fragile new regime could never survive without William's veteran army. Still others argue that she had no real choice in the matter at all. For what leverage does a princess hold when the man commanding the military threatens to leave? We will never know if she acted out of wifely duty, political survival, or quiet coercion. But the historical result remains a documented, undeniable fact that shaped the nation. She was the only person in the entire coup with a legitimate legal right to rule, and she gave that power away to a foreign prince. On the 6th of February, Parliament resolved that James had legally abdicated by fleeing the country. 1 week later, William and Mary were officially proclaimed joint sovereigns of the English nation. There was a historical precedent for this arrangement, but with one telling difference. Mary Tudor had married Philip of Spain in 1554, and they had ruled jointly. But when Mary Tudor died 4 years later, Philip immediately lost the English throne. This new political agreement was structured differently by the men who drafted it. It explicitly stated that if Mary died first, William would continue to rule as sole king. That singular clause reveals exactly who benefited most from this unprecedented royal arrangement. The royal coronation took place on the 11th of April in 1689. The ceremony was heavily rushed to secure the visual authority of the crown. Parliament and the new monarchs needed to publicly demonstrate the regime change as quickly as possible. It was a joint coronation of a king regnant and a queen regnant. This was unprecedented in English history, and it has never been repeated since. Every other coronation before or after has featured one reigning monarch, with or without a consort. William sat in the ancient traditional coronation chair used by centuries of English kings. A second chair was built specifically for Mary, explicitly modelled to match the old one. It was used exactly once in history, on that specific day in 1689. That wooden chair still sits quietly in the shadows of Westminster Abbey today. The Archbishop of Canterbury, William Sancroft, flatly refused to officiate the royal ceremony. He refused to recognise the legitimacy of the two monarchs who had usurped a king. Because of this boycott, the person who physically placed the crowns on their heads was the Bishop of London. His name was Henry Compton. This was the exact same man who had married them 12 years earlier in 1677. He was also one of the 7 men who had signed the letter inviting the invasion. The political circle of her life had closed around her. Their ascension to the throne came with profound, permanent constitutional strings attached. Parliament presented the Declaration of Right, which later became the historic Bill of Rights. It established that a monarch could no longer levy taxes without the strict consent of Parliament. They could not maintain a standing army during peacetime without the strict consent of Parliament. It was a shift in power, continuing the long historical arc begun by Magna Carta. These documents severely limited the absolute authority that her father and grandfather had desperately claimed. Mary had given away the one thing that only she possessed by birth. And almost immediately after she secured the crown, her husband left the country to fight. He left her completely alone to govern 3 kingdoms that had just overthrown their king. Ruling while he was away, William was almost never at home to govern the country he had just conquered. He spent his years fighting in Ireland and leading military campaigns across the Low Countries. Mary was left behind as the reigning monarch on the ground in London and Westminster. She managed the domestic affairs of 3 nations while he commanded the continental wars. The physical distance between them required a constant flow of letters across the sea. She delegated the daily mechanics of government to the English Privy Council. This powerful group included several men who had originally invited her husband to invade, but she carried 2 specific burdens that could never be delegated to a committee. She had to serve as the public face of a new regime, and she had to manage the complex, shifting politics of a royal court. Many English aristocrats still harboured a quiet guilt over how King James was deposed. They required constant management by a monarch who understood their families and their pride. The domestic policy she touched most often was the management of the national treasury. The massive conflict known as the 9 Years' War consumed staggering amounts of money. She had to fund the military without raising taxes to a dangerous breaking point. If she pushed too hard, Parliament and the public would quickly turn against the new reign. She had to navigate custom duties and parliamentary budgets while balancing the royal chequebook. This endless financial burden did not naturally suit her personality at all. She possessed different interests, and she quietly preferred to pursue other endeavours. Despite her gentle public manners, Mary was not a weak or indecisive ruler. When the security of the regime was threatened, she struck with absolute authority. The first threat came from her own uncle, Henry Hyde, the Earl of Clarendon. He was the brother of her late mother, and he had never accepted the new monarchs. He publicly refused to swear the mandatory oath of loyalty to the crown. The government hesitated to touch the Queen's uncle as long as he remained relatively quiet. But in 1690, intelligence revealed he was communicating with an agent in France. This agent was maintaining a direct line of communication with her deposed father. Mary ordered her own uncle to be immediately arrested by the state. He was eventually released, but only on the strict condition that he permanently retire from politics. The highest levels of government were reminded that blood would not protect them from treason. The second major threat to the regime arrived late in 1691. John Churchill, the Earl of Marlborough, was a highly capable English military commander. The government discovered that he was secretly communicating with Jacobite rebels on the continent. Mary threw the famous general into the Tower of London for several weeks. His political career would only begin to recover after the Queen was dead. This treason investigation directly caused the greatest personal rupture of her entire life. Mary ordered her sister, Anne, to dismiss Marlborough's wife from her royal household. Sarah Churchill was Anne's closest friend and her most trusted confidant. Princess Anne flatly refused to obey the royal command. It was the year 1692, and the two sisters never spoke to each other again. The resentment between them had been building for years. Anne despised William, and this hatred was quietly encouraged by people like Sarah Churchill. For years, Mary had served as the tired mediator between her sister and her husband. She had absorbed their anger and tried to bridge the impossible gaps in her family. She had spent her life managing the delicate feelings of the people around her. But as the ruling queen of a nation at war, she could no longer mediate treason. This time, she did not negotiate or attempt to find a compromise. She issued a royal command, and she lost the only sister she had left. For what is a sister to a monarch who must choose the survival of the state? The burden of ruling also meant bearing the weight of its darkest chapters. In February of 1692, the massacre of Glencoe took place in the Scottish Highlands. The loyalty oath that the clan chiefs were required to swear was an oath to William and Mary. The slaughter occurred under the legal authority of both reigning monarchs. Her reign carries the indelible stain of that violence just as surely as his does. There is one small detail from these years that says more about her than any policy does. In the spring of 1692, she missed a Sunday church service because of a fever. It was the first time she had been absent from Sunday worship in 12 years. 12 years without a single Sunday missed. She had lost her father to an invasion and her sister to an argument. She was left alone to govern a restless kingdom that did not belong to her. She did this while the husband she loved was constantly away, fighting a continental war. But there was one specific part of her life that politics had not taken away. and that is the part of her legacy that she would leave behind the longest. Gardens, pugs, and a college in Virginia. Gardening was the greatest personal passion of her life. During her years in Holland, she was the driving force behind the gardens at Het Loo. This was the primary country palace of the House of Orange-Nassau in Apeldoorn. She worked closely with Claude Desgaux, a talented French landscape architect who had studied directly under the man who designed Versailles for King Louis XIV. It was a quiet, gentle paradox. For why would a queen whose husband spent his life fighting the French king hire a gardener trained at Versailles? When she later renovated Hampton Court in England, many architectural details deliberately mirrored that French royal estate. She transformed the old Tudor palace into a modern royal residence with expansive geometric gardens. Her most lasting physical achievement is Kensington Palace. In the late 1680s, the property was known as Nottingham House, and the royal couple bought it because they needed a residence close to London. They wanted to escape the damp fog of the Thames and the thick coal smoke of the city. Both of those environmental elements were dangerous for William's chronic asthma, so she hired Sir Christopher Wren, the greatest English architect of the era. He was the visionary man who had rebuilt much of London after the Great Fire of 1666. Wren added 2 brick wings, private apartments, servant quarters, and expansive formal gardens. They moved into the palace in late 1689, and Mary immediately commissioned the building of the space, now known as the Queen's Gallery. A fire in 1691 actually led to an even grander reconstruction. The burned sections were replaced with a marble staircase and new state galleries. A young Nicholas Hawksmoor helped to construct the King's Gallery during this period. Most of what modern tourists see today was added later by Queen Anne and the Hanoverian kings. But the initial architectural vision belonged to Mary and William. They were also dedicated patrons of English music, and they supported Henry Purcell, who is considered the greatest English opera composer. Purcell consciously moved away from the dominant Italian and French musical models. He created a distinct, uniquely English sound, and there was a strict political reason for this artistic choice. Baroque music in the style of the French and Austrian courts was associated with Catholicism. The new regime favoured an austere, distinctly Protestant musical aesthetic. Purcell's compositions often leaned towards sombre passages drawn directly from the Psalms. Mary also took a firm stance on public morality, patronising the Society for the Reformation of Manners in 1691. This group specifically targeted swearing, prostitution, public drunkenness, and theatre. She issued royal proclamations against vice and sponsored the printing of court sermons. London at the end of the 17th century genuinely became a more restrained city. It was undeniably quieter than the wild, libertine days of King Charles II, but she was actively suppressing the exact court culture that had raised her. It was a culture that her devout father had never been a stranger to. In May of 1689, the government passed the historic Act of Toleration. This law granted religious freedom to radical Protestant groups like the Baptists, Puritans, and Quakers. It permanently shaped the religious environment of England well into the 19th century. She also initiated reforms of the Anglican liturgy, assigning the Bishop of London to lead the committee. Her influence also stretched across the Atlantic Ocean. In 1691, a Scottish missionary named James Blair arrived from Virginia. He came to England to formally request a royal charter for a new educational institution. At that time, all the English colonies in North America possessed exactly one college, and that single institution was Harvard. Mary eagerly accepted the proposal, and the royal charter was granted in February of 1693. Blair became the first president of the College of William and Mary. The school was funded by a dedicated tax on Virginia tobacco shipped to English ports. It was built in a remote settlement that eventually became the colonial town of Williamsburg. Today, it remains the second oldest college in the United States, carrying her name into the modern era. Away from the heavy matters of state, she was a woman with personal hobbies. She loved pug dogs, and goldfish ponds began to appear in the palaces around London. She loved to ice skate, a pastime the Stuart court had learned, while exiled in the Low Countries. There is also a strange numerical footprint to her life. There are 97 existing portraits of a woman who only lived to the age of 32. She did not sit for all of them, as many are contemporary copies. But it remains an unusually high number for a monarch with such a short reign. Petrus Lely painted her around 1672 in the pose of Diana, the goddess of the hunt. But her most famous portrait was painted around 1677, the year she was married. In it, she is wearing a dress coloured in orange. It was the vibrant colour of the royal house she had just entered. Everything just described happened in a span of less than 6 years. She did not even live long enough to see all of these projects fully take shape. The winter the Thames froze. In the middle of the 1690s, Mary was a healthy, vigorous woman. Aside from her early struggles with childbearing, there was absolutely no reason to think she would not live long and reign for decades. Her sudden death was a catastrophic shock to the entire nation, rather than a slow, predictable decline. In November of 1694, the Queen contracted smallpox, the deadliest disease of the early modern world. The plague came and went in waves, but smallpox was a permanent, terrifying presence across Europe. It killed hundreds of thousands of people every year, and it left millions of survivors with heavily pockmarked faces. It ultimately killed around 15% of the people who contracted it. It was the exact same disease that had killed both of William's parents. It was the disease that had nearly killed William himself in the 1670s. Her physical symptoms first appeared in early December, revealing she had contracted the hemorrhagic form of the virus. The illness worsened dramatically in the second half of the month. She died on the 28th of December in 1694 at Kensington Palace at the age of 32. When she fell ill, Princess Anne had tried to visit her at the palace. As we know, Mary refused to let her sister into the sick room. Now we understand the quiet mercy behind that final silence. Anne was pregnant at the time and possessed absolutely no immunity to the deadly smallpox virus. The refusal was not a final act of spite, but a desperate act of protection. The two sisters never saw each other again. The winter of that year was unusually brutal, falling at the end of the Little Ice Age. The temperature dropped so low that the River Thames froze solid. Traffic and movement around London became so paralysed that the government decided to delay the funeral until the spring. She lay in state at the banqueting house in Whitehall for several quiet weeks. The state funeral was finally held on the 5th of March in 1695. The ceremony cost £50,000, an absolute fortune for the era. The sombre music was composed by Henry Purcell. That same music would be used at his own funeral just 1 year later. The Queen's funeral was an unprecedented event in English history. Both the House of Lords and the House of Commons attended the ceremony together, but William was not there. He did not have the physical or emotional strength to walk into the church. She was buried in Westminster Abbey, resting in the south aisle of King Henry VII's chapel. The government planned to build a massive stone monument in her honour. It was never built because the physical space in the chapel was far too narrow. Today, only a small stone marks the exact spot. William would be placed in the earth beside her 7 years later. In 1725, 2 life-size wax effigies of the monarchs were placed in the abbey. How do we weigh the final legacy of these 2 interconnected lives? One of them treated the English crown purely as a military weapon. He used it exactly as he intended, and he succeeded in the only task he pursued his entire life. He broke the power of France, even at the heavy cost of his health, his peace, and the affection of his own subjects. The other held the only legitimate right to rule, gave it away, and died before knowing what it was truly worth. From one angle, she is the central, indispensable figure of one of the biggest turning points in English history. From another angle, she was a faint queen. She was content to stand in her husband's shadow, and she was on the throne for only 6 years. And then there was the cost neither of them could do anything about. They had no children. Everything they built together passed directly to her sister, Anne. She endured 17 pregnancies. Not one child survived past the age of 11. When Queen Anne finally died in 1714, the throne passed to the Hanoverians in Germany. There was no lasting dynastic link between England and the Dutch Republic. Only the constitutional institution remained standing. In the very end, who paid the higher personal price for this royal crown? Or is the real paradox that a political marriage neither of them wanted ended up forging the bedrock of the modern constitutional monarchy? If this paradox left you thinking, be sure to subscribe to Yesterday's Voices for more deep dives into the lives that shaped our world. Thank you for listening.